Today's topic is conservation technology, and this series is brought to you by the Center for Wildlife Studies. My name is Anubhav Vanamamalai. I've been a research fellow at the Center for Wildlife Studies for the past 5 years. And although a lot of my work is focused on human-wildlife interactions, technology and the way that it's used in conservation has always been a really fascinating field, and it's something that I'm really excited to delve deeper into with our panelist today, who is a man that needs no introduction, but will still get one. Topher White is the founder and CEO of the immensely popular Rainforest Connection. So Topher has experience building systems for large and small startups, as well as for international science projects. He had worked 4 years on nuclear fusion at ITER in France, and for the past 7 years has been iterating on and implementing acoustic hardware and software to detect illegal activities and monitor biodiversity across the world. He's received multiple accolades for his work, including a National Geographic Emerging Explorer, a Draper Richards Kaplan Fellow, and an engineering hero by the IEEE Institute, as well as being a Rolex Associate Laureate. So welcome, Topher. It's great to have you on the show.
Good. There's some things that CWS knows a little bit about as well. I'd say National Geographic and Rolex for sure.
Right, but engineering hero by IEEE, those guys take everything seriously. So that's an incredible achievement, I guess.
Cool. Yeah, they really are interested in kind of delving into the history of things as well as the way in which it's all put together.
So do you want to give us a quick background about yourself? How'd you get into such a field? Your trajectory as such?
Sure. I mean, I think like the rest of the people on this call most likely worked in technology. My background is really in sort of physics and software engineering, and kind of growing up, I'd heard a lot about the fact that the environment really mattered. But growing up in a city, you're not too connected to it, right? So we all kind of care about what happens off in the forest or what happens off in nature, but you don't actually have a way to get involved. But in my case, as you sort of mentioned, I was in France working at a place called Ebird, a fusion power plant, so to speak, which is actually an Indian project as well in France. But I'd always loved gibbons, these apes that are actually out in Indonesia. And I went to visit there as a volunteer and sort of saw that they were having a big issue with illegal logging, and had an idea for pitching technology into them, and pitched it to them, and they said, yes, please build that for us. And then it took me several years. But once you get into this hook where you're building something for somebody else, it's really hard to get out of it. And I feel really fortunate that that problem has kind of snowballed into a whole lot of other initiatives as well.
So I
yeah,
watched
always
a couple
build
of
something for somebody.
Okay, always build something for somebody.
Then you'll never be able to stop.
Because there was this video that you shared on a TED Talk, I believe, of you building the first Guardian in your parents' basement. Is
that's
that
right,
this
in San
project?
Francisco?
Yeah.
But that's a rite of passage, I think, is building something in a garage in San Francisco. Like if you're going to build a startup, it doesn't have to be San Francisco, but it has to start in some sort of garage.
Has to, right?
But in this case, it sincerely did. Very much so. I think that I really go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just saying you've taken a garage concept and turned it into a large, successful nonprofit organization called Rainforest Connection. So how'd you get to building, small guardians in a garage to one of the giants of in the conservation tech space?
That's far too kind. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but I would say that for us, it's all about how do we automate some of the things that we felt people themselves were doing somewhat inefficiently, which I think is probably the case with all technology that we build, right? One of the things that's out there is that you see people like redesigning their goals based on what is hard to accomplish. In this case, it's that it's really hard to listen and gather data from the forest. Listening is a great way to figure out what's happening in a large area throughout, say, a forest or different ecosystem. With camera traps, you can see what's in front of you, very, very powerful. With satellites, you can see almost the entire planet, but you can really only see what's happening in a lower resolution and really sort of only from moment to moment. So maybe a week or a month or a day. And so there was a missing sort of piece there. And so by being able to really focus on data that we don't really focus on, basically we're very visual creatures, but audio is something that really sort of pervades the forest. And sound is kind of like the way that nature expresses itself in a lot of ways. So really being able to zero in on that as a way of sort of know what's happening in the forest, and of course to then detect threats. But what was really important about it was that sound is really heavy. These were technological problems that people were coming up with very sort of unnovel solutions to, like send
Okay.
people out to collect the data or the rest. So we sort of took those things for granted, really sort of dived in to see whether we could get this data out of the forest automatically. And then, of course, that's when it opened up lots of new possibilities for us. So I can
Okay.
get into the specifics of that. But in general, I would say that the conservation and to a certain degree, conservation science is largely limited by what people um, think think is hard or think the technology won't allow. And so sometimes if you take some of those questions for granted, you can you can actually sort of skirt those things. And that is science in general. So there's a scientific element to
Right.
conservation technology that I really like.
So, okay, let's just get the definitions out of the way. So,
Sure.
what's your opinion? What is conservation technology?
Conservation technology, I would generally say, is the invention or the promotion of tools that help in the measurement of nature, help in the protection of the environment. Um, and I think conservation technology also sort of has a field kit element to it, like field tools that can be used in the field, um, or that can
So,
be effective.
you're kind of, is this encompassing, hardware and software?
Certainly,
Is Yeah, okay.
certainly. Yeah,
And
I think people always think of conservation as a hardware-based thing, but I think that at the end of the day, software is eating the world, and the ability to use more and more software, or even make more of the hardware software-oriented, is definitely the way to go.
so boots on the ground, but backed up by the cloud. Is that the model here?
Absolutely, but again, the idea of the cloud, as it's sort of put out there, is an exceptionally difficult problem for field work and for people
Right.
in the field. Being connected to the cloud is taken for granted when you're in a city. Doesn't work so well when you're out in the forest.
Right. Okay. So that's actually been one of the challenges that Rainforest Connection has worked on, right? You have
Mhm.
devices. So for the audience, just to give you a little bit of a background about Rainforest Connection, of course, there's some incredible videos out there, a lot of work that's been put out on the interweb. But so Rainforest Connection has basically has paved the way for acoustic remote sensing, right? So they created one of the first scalable real-time acoustic monitoring systems. And this is an integrated hardware and software solution, right? So they monitor species population, community diversity, and human activity. And they've collected data from 38 different countries. But you're a cloud-based platform, right? So
Yeah.
how are you getting data from super remote forests into the cloud?
Well, so this all started being in the forest and sort of realizing that sound was just pervasive, right?
Right.
But that people themselves were walking through the forest to collect data, or they walked through the forest to catch loggers in this particular case.
Mhm.
And that just struck me as not the best use of human time. Walking through the forest is really hard. It's hard to get from one place to the other. And you can't actually really hear chainsaws particularly well because the forest is so noisy. But as everyone here knows, computers can pick out almost anything from any sort of noisy signal. And so that was kind of the you know premise behind being able to try and use sound and computers to pick it out. But over time, I didn't have a lot of faith in our early ability. This is about 5, 6 years ago. Our early ability to do everything on the edge, which means to sort of analyze audio and sort of pick these things out on the device itself. So set out to try and transmit all these things from the forest up to the cloud and do the analysis in the cloud, and then send the alerts back to people on the ground so they can go stop loggers. That's the
Mhm.
whole thing.
Okay.
Um, and in doing so, had to build a system that could get large amounts of audio data out of the cloud in a real-time fashion. Um, Now, that of course has lots of baggage attached to it. That's a difficult thing to accomplish, and in many ways, people were telling us that it wasn't the way to go, and they were probably right. But in doing so, we were able to build a system that could be used by a lot of other applications as well. Um, so, just kind of get back to it, I would say that the extent to which everything connects. See, in conservation technology, I'll sort of back up on this. Everyone wants to build like the coolest possible device, or
Of
they want to
course.
build the most amazing analysis. And those are both really, really important things. Those are actually the extent to which people get excited about it. But the way in which stuff connects in between is what always gets taken for granted. It's kind of like the non-sexy problems that certain organizations end up making a lot of money doing for big corporations or other. It's the people who connect things that end up making the biggest difference sometimes. And in conservation technology, I think that's something that it needs more work. How to pull things together and make it less about like the hero projects and more about the way in which those projects can lead to better efficiency overall.
So one of the things that actually set Rainforest Connection apart was the scalability aspect and the fact that you use low cost devices, at least initially, right? So recycled cell phones.
Yes, some of this all came out of the idea that originally I was going to build, again, a device that could do all this great stuff. And then
Right.
after looking around on eBay, I realized that I could get an old Android phone for like $5 a long time ago, and realized that was a great development platform. And myself, as much as I like to tinker around with hardware and the rest, software development is a way more reliable way to develop something. And so that was a pretty, you know, irresistible way to try and develop something. So
Right.
essentially, for the first 5, 6 years of this, in fact, still to this day, there are basically old smartphones, old Android smartphones, up in trees in the rainforest, capturing all the sound of the forest, processing it to a certain degree, but sending it in real time up to the cloud, where we analyze it and then send alerts back to people on the ground over that same network. So yeah, essentially old cell phones in trees. The good news about that is that it doesn't sound all that high tech. There's a lot of technology that goes into it, but in many ways, it's almost like a metaphor that helps skip all of the difficulties in there and telling people how it works. So when you think of an old cell phone in a tree, you kind of get the fact that it's listening, and you kind of get the fact that it's connected to some sort of overall network. So in many ways, the hardest part in technology as well is getting people to understand how the thing works and how it can be useful to them. And those metaphors really help in helping people sort of latch on to what you're doing, especially because a lot of your users in conservation are not necessarily technically savvy. In scientific areas, people are quite technically savvy, but the rangers and park guards and the rest, they all have old smartphones. They all have smartphones, and they all can connect to it. But when you start getting into cloud computing and the connections and what latency works, and you know logins and passwords and things like that, forget it. They're not interested. So
Right.
these things really help.
So I think that's a good segue into some of these questions about what are the barriers in terms of getting into a field like conservation technology? Do you need to code? Is that the first barrier to entry? Do you need to have an advanced degree, or do you just need to have an
Oh,
idea and some way of getting, you know, to solve a
certainly
solution?
not. So of all the people on this call, I probably have the least advanced degree um, altogether.
Well, you worked
But
on
yeah,
nuclear fusion, so I'm not gonna.
sure. Well, I mean that's kind of thing is that there's always, as long as there's somebody who needs you to solve a problem and you're willing to kind of throw yourself into it, you'll come up with a solution that can be useful. You just have to keep realizing that building the coolest thing, and this is really hard for us, building the coolest thing is not usually the most helpful solution to attack. So let's see how to get into it. I think for me personally, once you're on the hook to do something, that's when it really sort of pushes you to get it done. You can always want to build something, but if it's only up to you, you're never going to get it out there. Um, in fact, still to this day, we sort of delay releases that we shouldn't. But once somebody's expecting something and they're relying upon it, so find yourself these problems for people that you need to do the work that they're doing. So one way to look at it from our perspective with Rainforest Connection is we're a bunch of technology folks who are around the world. I'm inside right now in a city in San Francisco. But our ability to fight climate change or protect environments around the world is highly limited, and rightfully so. But you have these rangers out there in the field who have the ability to protect their own backyard, and protecting your own backyard can have a very outsized effect on fighting climate change. What can we do that can contribute to that? It's just build tools that encourage them to do the work they do and make it easier and more safe. So in many ways, it's like a proxy. Technology always is a proxy for impact. You're building tools that can help more people do what they do better. And there's no better place to do that than in conservation, because it's in many ways the most under-addressed area in technology, I would say, and also the most rewarding.
Right. So you mentioned that you have a global team, right? So I'm assuming this is kind of different data scientists, obviously, PhDs and postdocs that are working on the analysis side of things, people to maintain your hardware. Is this something that you've built up over time? Did you go with that plan of having a global team, or did it just happen organically?
So it's so funny you mentioned those specific roles that you, because those are actually the ones that are most under addressed on our team,
Okay.
to be
All
honest.
right.
So, but yeah, I'm in San Francisco. I grew up here, but in many cases I moved back here because I was in France working on fusion, but I moved back to San Francisco in like 2012, 13, because this was when the startup scene was really heating up. And I
Okay.
saw that with the sort of advent of cloud computing, this was really the moment of cloud computing and open source software frameworks and the rest. This was the moment when you could build a startup from nothing. And this is when I wanted to sort of dive in on this idea. And I got back here, and to be honest, the company is not based here. Uh, I thought that San Francisco was a great place to start a tech startup, but it didn't make a bit of difference. The best people for the team, the most interested people for this problem, came from all over the world. And so at this point, I'm the only one in this city. The entire rest of the team of 30 people is sort of scattered throughout the world, because for a problem like this, it's not based in one place. Now, there's lots of people who support the project who are here, but by no means is this anything other than an address. And in fact, it's one of the hardest addresses to go pick up mail because only one of us is here. So I don't think that where you are makes as much of a difference in conservation technology, with one exception, which is that you have to be connected to where it matters. So you have to know who's using it and a connection to the field, which we'll get into later.
Yeah. So, okay, we can get into that now, actually. So you work a lot with on-ground partners across different countries. Do they approach you? Do you approach them? Both?
Yeah, I would. So there is, yeah. So when this all got started for us because again, I did had that one moment that I mentioned earlier. I was in
Mhm.
Indonesia and saw there was a need for this and pitched it to them and they said yes. Then I spent the better part of a year and a half building it, which is a long time for somebody to wait for something. But then put it back in Indonesia and had that really lucky moment where we put the system up, it picked up chainsaws, we caught loggers, right? And at
Right.
that particular moment, we started talking about it. And once you talk about something, there's an opportunity for people to come to you and ask for help. We had a Kickstarter campaign, which we marketed the hell out of, and online, and had enough support to sort of go for it. But none of these things sound like we just. It actually took us 2 years. 2 years between
Right.
having the idea, testing it, and actually getting to the point where we could put it anywhere else. So
Mhm.
2 years of trying to like get the world to care. Um, but that's not necessarily the right way to go. I'd say that at all given times, you should be putting your time into trying to get the technology to a place that you can put it out in the field and get people using it, because there is an inverse relationship between talking about something and getting recognition thereby for it and actually getting it done. So in many ways, the more you talk about something, you get a certain degree of feedback that makes you feel like you've accomplished something when you haven't quite yet. And so I would say that our need to kind of build up this company and get people interested in it slowed down our ability to build technology that we felt really good about and that our partners could use more. So, but you have to do it all at the same time when you're building it, when you're building a company.
Right.
You have to talk about it so that people are aware of it. You have to put it out there so that you figure out whether people actually want it. And of course, you can never neglect getting into the hands of people in the field.
So the approach is put it out in the field, iterate as much as possible based on feedback, and shout it from the rooftops. Um,
Yeah,
is
and I
that
think you'll
the
find, yeah, and I think you'll find in tech, in conservation tech, the most valuable thing is that connection to the field. Um, this may be something that CWS takes for granted because you're very connected to the field and to the communities that you work with. But even some of our biggest supporters, tech companies that I'm sure we'll get to talk about later, uh, you know, the thing that we offer the most in partnership with them is our connection to these really obscure and highly, when I say valuable, I mean from a conservation standpoint, highly valuable communities on the ground, the ones who can actually make a difference. Um,
right?
so that's kind of where things get in there. I'd say never lose your connection to the field because that's what keeps you very aware of what isn't working in
Okay.
conservation technology.
So in that sense, what are some of the challenges when you talk about working with really vulnerable populations, both in terms of wildlife and remote communities of people? Some of the challenges that you've had between countries, or are there some shared challenges that you face normally?
Yeah. So every conservation solution is very local.
Okay.
There's no such thing as
Right.
like a global conservation solution that I'm aware of yet. And so it's if you're looking like if you want to get attention for your work in conservation technology, all the journalists are looking for like the solution that's going to change everything.
Right.
But the more you do it, um, and governments are looking for that too. But the more you do it, the more you realize that conservation really comes down to local people in an area caring about a place, willing to put themselves out there, taking responsibility for it, whether or not they're legally backed in doing so. And most importantly, conservation that lasts for 5 years or 10 years isn't conservation. Like it's an important way to
Right.
start, but
Right.
the only real thing that protects an area is when one generation after the other is actually taking it on. And so, yeah, that makes it really hard to build a solution that you can use in, 30 plus countries. But the truth, as everyone here kind of knows, is that people are not too different from one place to the other. There are some predictable things about them. And at the end of the day, you have to make sure that you're looking out for their safety, first of all, their financial interest on the end. And if you're lucky, you can insert conservation and environmental concerns into like the top 5 or 6. And that's where finding the right partners really matters. But so at the, we're still at this. We're still trying to figure this out. But I would say there's more in common with Indonesia, Brazil, Peru, Central Africa than there is that separates them. But we get super obsessed with the differences in one area to the next. And so
Okay. Yeah, I
so
mean, local partners are, of course, really important. I don't
mm,
think anybody else understands the nuances of that situation better than someone who's on the ground. And you're right, conservation solutions can't be 5, 10 years. They need to be long-term solutions, unless they happen to solve the problem, which we haven't really seen in the conservation world in a while, right? So it is a long-term investment. But saying that, having that long-term investment, going in with a tech solution, which is this ever-changing field, right? There's always something new coming out in tech. How do you kind of balance that out? You need a long-term solution, but there's things that are changing so rapidly. Machine learning and AI in conservation wasn't a thing up to like 5, 6 years ago.
mhm. Well, I think that there's an element to good technology that isn't about the new, or if it's about the new is hidden. You know,
Okay.
um, one of the reasons that people like Apple products so much is that they don't. First of all, it's always the best thing that they're putting out there. It's always the best. They've rechanged everything, except they haven't, and they've hidden the stuff underneath. So when we go to the rangers and give them an app that'll tell them in real time where the chainsaws in their forest are, or we'll tell them in real time where certain animals are, we aren't explaining or even using buzzwords or even
Mm-hmm.
explaining what the technology behind it. In fact, technology behind it is often very shaky. Um, all they know is that sort of the the outputs are what we say they're going to be, and oftentimes the outputs fail. We have to keep
Right.
improving on it. So you know, people are pretty patient with what does or doesn't work. And the more you try to improve something, the riskier it is that it won't perform the way they want. But it's interesting you mentioned that one because we have some really cool partnerships now with organizations. One of them is Hitachi.
Mm-hmm.
Hitachi Vantara is basically helping us to develop this detector where we listen to the sounds of the forest as we do, and now when we hear a chainsaw, we'll use AI and TensorFlow to be able to send an alert after the chainsaw occurs, as you
Right.
would think. But Hitachi comes to us and says, we think we can use all of these bioacoustic insights, the sounds of the forest, to be able to predict in advance when a chainsaw is going to go off based upon the sort of perturbations of what's happening in the soundscape.
Wow.
So that's a really cool idea in principle, and it's actually scientifically feasible. But imagine trying to explain to rangers that you're gonna tell them in advance, 6 or 8 hours in advance when a chainsaw goes off. Even if they understand the concept of it, because these aren't dumb guys, why would they sort of believe that and run off? And there's a whole lot of faith you
Right.
have to get. It's one thing from a scientific endeavor; it's a whole other thing to say this is something that you should use, to react, because reaction, of course, is expensive and dangerous, and all sorts of things involved in that. So, um, in many ways, we have to sort of, as we should, we have to stack all of these different elements, these different technologies up towards one very simple goal, which is about awareness, response, understanding, and frankly collaboration. Because we can get into that later. We also come face to face, very much so. In fact, our organization is realigning itself towards being very cognizant of the fact that technology and awareness is simply not enough to spur environmental protection. There needs to be a lot more that goes into it.
So, this is really interesting, just because as you mentioned, the amount of faith that someone has to have on technology, especially if it's predictive, right? If it's reactive, sure, it happened, and we kind of know it happened, so let's go send our rangers into that area. If it's predictive,
Well,
do you think that's down to the field partners to really kind of push that trust, or do you want to make sure that the tech works first before you actually send people out? How much
well,
of testing would you do before that?
let's dive, well, a lot, but let's dive into even reactive.
All
So
right.
so reactive is a whole other thing. When you say, well, this happens all the time for us. We we hear a chainsaw,
Mhm.
we analyze it, we send an alert, even if it's 100% accurate. If you got a message on your phone that said there's somebody downstairs and they have a weapon, or there's somebody stealing something from your storage shed down the road.
Yeah, I'm hiding
Uh,
him below my bed. I'm not really gonna
well,
look.
that one I think you could check, right? But the whole thing is that when you're telling somebody about some insight that's occurring farther away, you have to add a little more information into it. It's a whole lot for someone. It's a whole lot of faith for someone to have in a system to react to it, and not even just that. Like it's not really fair. So when we say it's really important for us when we tell somebody there's a chainsaw in the forest or there's a gunshot in the forest, we have to give them the piece of data that we're basing that on. We have to play it back for them. They have to be able to verify for themselves, even not so just so they believe us, but so they feel like there's some more context going into it. Like
Hmm.
imagine that they're going to jump on a motorcycle and go off and catch somebody, but they have no idea what they're getting into. So
Right.
context building around the data is really, really important. And so we sort of noticed that. And as the technology gets more advanced, hopefully that helps us build more context. But the further we go into these remote regions, the harder it is to get more data out. So the less context we have. So we're trying to strike that balance. So at the end of the day, I would say you can't expect people to dive blindly into situations. And so the more information you put in front of them, uh, not like numbers and things like that, just because that these it needs to be sort of something that builds the experience they're about to sort of have. That really helps.
Okay.
Because to be so conservation tech isn't always about threat detection. It isn't always
Right.
about trying to stop people who are hurting the forest.
Right.
That's like just a very important high impact thing that we do. Um, a lot of times it's about gathering scientific insights, and that's just as important in the long run. But I would say that if you're trying to convince people to take action on anything, it's a major, major, major challenge. And so that for us is something that we think about all the time. And I could spend a whole panel just talking about how to convince people to do what they have committed to saying they would do with information that's provided to them.
So that's really interesting. I think there's a lot of depth there in what you said, because that really is the on-ground challenge. You can have all the technology behind you, but if you can't get people to move or act on that technology, you have to find ways that kind of embolden them to do so. And
And
you
that's
know, yeah,
totally relatable,
yeah,
completely relatable.
yeah,
Which
exactly. It
one
makes
doesn't
sense.
want to jump on a motorcycle and go stop some
Right,
well-armed loggers in the forest?
of
I
course.
mean, you got to back them up, right?
Yep, that's true. So let's take a step back in that sense, and just maybe talk about data sharing in organizations that are, conservation tech companies. So I know that Rainforest Connection is a nonprofit, but there are a lot of for-profit social ventures that are getting into conservation tech, especially in the recent past. And then there are the large multinational corporations, these, giants of technology that are getting into the space as well. What are your thoughts on these two? Is the competition really high here? Is it getting saturated, or is there still, space for someone to innovate and get in?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So I for one, I clearly think it's a very good thing that tech companies are getting, like large tech companies, multinationals, as you sort of mentioned it, are getting involved in this, particularly because it's kind of all of our responsibility. I'm not at all worried that we or anybody isn't going to be able to come up with innovations that still matter, particularly because the corporations are very creative, full of very very smart people who are coming up with great things
Yeah.
to do, but they're still kind of driven by their own momentum in a certain direction. But I would push back on anyone who said that they were not very sincere in their pursuit of this, because I think we all care. And these corporations are trying to find a way to exist in a world that's changing, and they want to be a part of it. And also, I think there's a whole other thing around discovery. So if you are, a large tech company like a Google, a Microsoft, Huawei, one of these big companies, you're invested in what you can do with data and AI, and everything around us has been super focused on human-based data, like what are people doing with their selling habits and buying habits and living their life, and that of course has drastically affected our living conditions over the past decade, really just last decade, I guess, not much more. But we're reaching this point of diminishing returns. And so what is like the next frontier of data? What is the next frontier by which AI can tell us about what's around us? And it might be the natural world. So for better or for worse, this is sort of a huge data dump, a huge data store that can bring some new understanding of our own selves, our own life, whether it's for pharmaceutical purposes or conservation purposes or discovery purposes or protection purposes. I would say that you could look into outer space, you can look to the deep sea, or you can look to your own forest. And the more sort of indices that we have of data to feed into these algorithms is going to teach us more about ourselves and the world. So I think they're very sincere in going after it, even if it's only for business purposes. And I'm pretty sure it's not for profit, because there's not a huge amount of money in conservation technology. I'll put that out there.
Just
So
a disclaimer, just a disclaimer to the audience.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you spoke about big data and this giant accumulation. Obviously, that takes a lot of resources that some of these tech companies have. May not be what some of the younger players in this space do. So how do you actually get to that expansion? How do you scale? How do you replicate? How do you grow a conservation tech company if you had to, in order to be able to play?
Very uncomfortably. That's kind of, I mean, I there's this whole idea in startups of like product market fit. And of course, in conservation tech, it's a little bit different because you have a sort of mission that you're trying to carry out, at least in not-for-profit ventures.
Right.
But the point is that when something is going well, it's just actually very uncomfortable and terrifying at the same time. So we have a system now that allows us to filter in. So we have these guardians, these devices, autonomous ones that are out around the world in high-risk places that are streaming data to the cloud, and we're analyzing it. And we have a group of scientists who are not even on our team, like scientists who are users, who use our system to do their research, who are analyzing that audio data. At the same time, we have machine learning algorithms that are analyzing for threats that have to be very accurate. And there's a team of people that are analyzing that, and that data gets out to the rangers in the field. And the rangers gather data and they send it back. Now, that's like maybe half of the pieces that are in there, and every single one of them could break at any time. And every single one of them often does break, and it's usually the ones that it's usually you don't find it out until the moment when you need something to happen. And so as that scales, again, we built all these things in response to needs. So we're at this point now where we have to really kind of reflect on what is the vision of how this thing is supposed to all work together, and let's like look 5-6 years into the future and try and rebuild it. But I would just say that obviously you don't want to prematurely optimize something. But no, like scaling and getting this thing to work is not going to be something where you sit back and feel fantastic about how it's all working. It's just never going to be like that. It's going to be a lot of moments where everything is breaking down, and you have to get in there and fix it for people. And the more you care about those people, the worse it is. The more you care about the work they're doing, the harder it is to realize that you let them down in a certain way. And we've done that dozens of times. There's also many, many more times, I would like to think, that we've provided them exactly what they need and made a difference. So I don't know if that's answered your question, except that it's not fun. It's very rewarding, but it's not necessarily fun all the time.
Well, as you said, there's a huge investment, mentally, emotionally, as well as your time and resources into the kind of work that you're doing. And you, of course, want everything to run properly. But one thing that you mentioned was, trying to plan optimization in the sense of, creating everything perfect from the start. Going back to the story, you started off on a mobile phone. You're now working with better models, better iterations of the Guardian units that you're developing, possibly in the future, your own hardware. Is there a limit to, the low technology, low cost solution? Is that at some point you have to go to an advanced model? You have to maybe expand a bit or expend a bit more capital in terms of developing a solution?
Yeah, we are. I mean, so that's the phase that we're in right now, is putting more resources into, our own hardware that can do a lot more. I think you saw our new hardware. I think it's in the thumbnail you put out there. In fact, and you were the one who said it looks like a ceiling fan, which is true.
It does
I
look like a
appreciate that.
ceiling fan.
I appreciate that.
We have
That's
a
good.
lot.
That was what I was looking for. And you're like, it's a ceiling fan. I was like, that's what it is. Okay, but it's just solar panels that come out. And
Right.
anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. What I'll say to that is that, so value is, people say they want a low cost solution, but low cost is really about value, right? So they're let's look at acoustics. And by the way, my apologies to anybody who wanted to show up and talk about other types of technology. We should talk about those too. But if you look at acoustics, there's really fantastic groups out there working on low cost recorders. One of them is Open Acoustic Devices in the UK. They make something called the Audio Moth, which you may have heard about. So having been in this space now for about 6 years, I would say 4 years ago, big conservation groups came to us and they said, you know what the world needs? They need like a $50 audio recorder. And we're like, okay, that's a little low for us in terms of what we're working on. But then this group came out with this $50 audio recorder, and it's great. It means the scientists can go record stuff around the world. But there's a lot of things that doesn't do. And that, for that space, if you're just trying to do what that thing does, you won't find a better value, right? But if you're looking for something that can, the value that something like we're bringing to, like the ability to autonomously monitor and control something from the field, basically like a satellite for the forest, then the cost of it becomes quite different. So don't focus so much on coming up with the cheapest solution, so much as coming up with a solution that is affordable based upon the value that it offers to the groups that you have. Now, in conservation, no one has any money at all. So it feels like you have to keep getting lower and lower and lower. But all you really need to make a difference and to make what you're building be worth it is finding one or two groups that can get something out of it, right? If like you don't need something that's going to protect the whole world. If people are dedicating their lives to protecting one park or one sort of reserve that they're responsible for, that's a huge thing to have accomplished, to help them do that. And we struggle with that all the time, trying to make sure that we're paying as much attention to the really high impact areas, as opposed to like making too many constellations in what we build to work on a larger scale.
All right. So I'm
not sure if that answers your question, but
it does. No, it's incredibly interesting to get this insight from someone that works in the field. I know that you mentioned that there might be audience members that want to talk about other things with acoustics, but this is absolutely fascinating. So I'm just going to ask the audience if they have any questions, to actually put them in the chat box, direct them to our co-host, so that we can get some of those going, so Topher can answer a few of them at least. But
I can sort of riff a little bit on, I think, the different technologies that go into it. You mentioned some. You mentioned remote sensing that the CWS does, some camera trapping that you guys do. I think I just want to give a shout out to satellite monitoring. Satellite monitoring is, at least in the sense that it's become democratized so that most people can get access to the data, is hugely important. It's completely changed our understanding of what's happening around the world. It hasn't necessarily changed what's happening on the ground always, but that I feel like technology sort of adds to understanding of what's there. But with understanding comes kind of a very sober, horror in terms of what you do or don't have the ability to affect. And so we're dealing with that with the technology that we put out there. Information is sometimes a curse as much as it is a blessing, because you realize that things that you're doing don't make a difference. You realize that you have to tell people what is or isn't working. And I can get into those details a little later if you'd like.
Right. So
I can also I can share my screen and do demos of some of these things later on in the call.
Well,
let's answer the questions.
No, so I'm just wondering, remote sensing, as you said, has been democratized. The fact that everybody has a cell phone nowadays, just having maps on your phone is something that you couldn't take for granted before. And they are really powerful conservation tools. Like everybody in this space uses a map, uses a GPS unit. And of course, taking it from there, we have remote sensing, the availability of these incredibly high resolution data sets that anyone can download and utilize for monitoring. There's a completely novel space, I think, in the last few years, which has been the use of conservation drones in terms
Mm.
of mapping both habitats and attaching sensors to drones to as lidar to map forest canopy covers, really detect what changes are happening on the ground. A lot of these are hardware driven, a lot of them are software driven and really depend more on the software to come up to a certain scale. What what's the next big revolution? Because we've looked at machine learning and AI for so long, and of course they're still being developed and by no means done. Is there something next that you see, looming on the horizon? Is there something moving towards us in terms of the space, or do we still have to, rely on ML AI as the next big thing?
Oh, so when it comes to ML and like machine learning and artificial intelligence, those things, I would say that they are going to become more and more sort of ingrained into what we have. We'll take them for granted if we don't already, and everything is there. It's just going to be a way by which data gets analyzed,
Right.
or gets sort of like presented to us. Um, I do think that there is still a reliance on hardware, um, but I also think that the idea of a drone being new or being expensive will change with time.
Right.
I think already the satellite imagery is getting to the point where it's going to be available as long as you don't need something that's totally new. As hackers, and I think that everyone here, whether you're a software or the rest, you kind of have a hacker mentality um, to it. You're focusing on what you can accomplish without like the newest and the greatest, and that also sort of translates to data as well. So, do you need like the most high resolution data that's available? Do you need the newest satellite imagery to do what you're doing? Chances are no, and certainly not to test whether what you're doing is effective. Um, and so, I think that's where making these things open and more available to more people so it can be better understood is better. I think a lot of work has to be done on like the interfaces to these things. Uh, so Rainforest Connection, RCX, you could say that our main interface is that it was alerts that go back to rangers to go stop things. But we have this huge, centuries of audio data from some of the most remote places in the world that's streaming into our system and it's being saved. We save it there so that scientists can study it. But a bunch of audio files sitting on a server doesn't do anything. You know,
Right.
people come to us all the time and they're like, I have 8 terabytes of audio data from the northern Amazon. What does that mean? That's nothing. It mostly that tells me you haven't listened to it, and you shouldn't listen to it, because that would take you several years.
Right.
But the ability to have these things available for querying via APIs to show you to interfaces to be able to share it with people, instead of making it about like files and the size of the files and moving them from one place to the other, I think focusing on the interfaces is so important. Google Earth, fantastic example of this. We all take this for granted, but imagine if like the extent to which you can sort of see a thread and be like, what's that? And zoom in and figure it out and then like go from one place to the other. That's of course an amazing technological accomplishment. But the fact that they're making it available to anybody through those interfaces is what allows like new discoveries to occur. So I think that's one of the next big revolutions in front of us and one of the biggest challenges in conservation tech.
So making big data accessible easily by anyone without, a background in really trying to analyze it. So having
Yeah.
products ready basically from the data that we're collecting and hopefully in real time or close to real time as possible.
Well, start with the data that you have, and then
Right.
like improve, iterate towards improvements. Because
So
where the data comes from is often a political conversation as much as anything else.
that's true. Yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, obviously, data sharing policies and how open we should be with, especially in the conservation space, is
Mhm.
another massive topic,
Sure.
because it's sensitive data, but it's also, a lot of it is public data. It is public land in a lot of cases, and every country has its own policies, so that's not something that I want to get into right now. Um,
But I mean, I really
so
can't say enough that people think that open data is about. Well, there's various tiers of open data, right? It
right,
begins with I
of
have some
course,
papers and I'll hand them to you. The next one is like I have an Excel file and the unstructured data, and it gets better and better and better. But somehow it feels like people are thinking that structured APIs are like the pinnacle of open data and being able to share with people, and they are very important. They're a step, but they're not. Like that's the only extent to which developers and people can pull it. It's the interfaces like Google Earth. It's interfaces like some of the things we're trying to work on, or the even better ones, or ones that
Mhm.
no one's thought of yet. That's going to be what like allows people who are interested in technology but aren't yet technologically adept to like explore and follow these threads and ideas and sort of get into it. Like if we can seed discovery, then we can seed excitement and interest. And you know, there's I don't want to, anyone who's putting a bunch of files open for download on their site, I don't want to put that down. But you haven't finished yet if that's what you've done.
Okay, so I'm gonna move a little bit into some of the questions that we have from the audience because that was pretty deep, and I want to let that sink in for some of the people, just to think a little bit more about what their own role is, and that kind of leads us to this question: is how can technology enable meaningful citizen participation? And I'm going to put this with the conservation space, but yeah. And
Yeah, I'd
vice
say that
versa, how can we contribute to conservation technology just as a regular citizen?
that is that's sort of yeah, that's a follow up on the question that, or so the thing I was just trying to say. I think it is the responsibility of all of us to look for ways to build new interfaces to existing data sets and existing systems that are there. Sometimes that means like offering yourself to work with a system that isn't yours. I can't tell you how often we get messages from very sincere, smart people who are like, your idea is great, but I think there's this one thing about it that like isn't optimized. So I want to rebuild the whole thing from scratch.
Right.
And you know, honestly, that happens like once a week. We get those messages from people, and I think at the end of the day, that's not very constructive. Not, I think they should, if they have a great idea, they should follow it. Right? We're not going to put it down, but I can tell you that if they could sort of latch onto what we have and carry it on their own for a while. So the same way is that if there's existing data sets, you want to build an interface to it to make it possible to access it, build off of systems that already exist. And there's some really, really great ones that are out there. Citizen scientist.
Mm-hmm.
One of my goal for Rainforest Connection would be to turn acoustics into something as great as like iNaturalist, which some of you may know about. It's a fantastic tool for capturing photos and sharing them with the world. Like when we look back 15, 20 years from now, this will be unbelievably valuable. A citizen science driven way to capture nature as it is right now. Because no matter what's happening, even if we can, yeah, we do live in a really important moment right now where no matter how good the work we do in conservation, 10 years from now, the world will be a more, environmentally impoverished place than it is today. Yeah. This is absolutely critical that we capture and preserve the way the world is at this moment so that we haven't totally lost it to history. And then maybe there's a chance of building it back. It may not ever be the world may never be as sort of verdant and special as it is right now. And so it's important to preserve that so that it's not forgotten, so that we can understand how we might get back to that point.
Yeah, I think that's great. And as you mentioned, there's some incredible apps out in the space. iNaturalist, there's Ebird, which are all important contributions, not just to creating a baseline data for what we're using, but it's actually used by a lot of research scientists in advancing causes for conservation. So as a citizen, it's really important to get out there, get in the field, or even just document the biodiversity in your backyard, because it's all important. It's all something that needs to be preserved for the rest of us. So yeah.
There's one additional thing I want to add to that. Sorry for around time, but but there's this around like citizen participation and the rest. Find some conservation person, like a real hero that you think you can help and you contribute to. Offer your services to them. You may have to offer it 10 times because they're very busy, but if you're able to, or the people that work with them, find someone that you want to help and then try and come up with a solution that they might make use of. Don't look for the high profile people. Look for the people who you think actually you might have a ability to relate to, and actually get their attention of. And so that's the way by which you can build solutions that matter. But ask for what they want, then build what you think they mean. Don't necessarily just solve the problem that they're suggesting. So for us, what we're finding is that no matter what information we give to people, it doesn't matter nearly as much as a conversation. So we can send someone an alert that says there's a chainsaw in the forest, and here's all the indices of data that make it very, very clear that it's happening. But that doesn't spur action nearly as much as getting on the phone with them and being like, yo, this is where the problem is. This is what we know about it. Get out there. That human connection is all the difference. Makes all the difference.
So speaking about human connections and collaborations as such, um, I think this might be a good time to discuss how CWS and Rainforest Connection are actually working together.
True.
So I mean, we're starting a project off, I think, later this year where we're really relying on some of the expertise from Rainforest Connection in our own conservation work, and we're utilizing their systems and experience in acoustic monitoring to help us create solutions to better tackle human wildlife interactions. And in particular, I think this is new for Rainforest Connection, is to see how we can detect elephants walking across a landscape with acoustic sensors. So I think that's great because it's a good challenge. One, it's a place where we haven't really explored the acoustic monitoring side of things, and you have the experience of acoustic monitoring, but never with the Asiatic elephants that we see with human wildlife interactions in the country.
It's true. Um, I'm really excited about this for a couple of reasons. First of all, working with you guys is a major honor, and something we've been sort of looking at for a long time. And I have to give major credit to Dr. Kriti for making the suggestion um, back in the day. I think that when she has an idea, she's like, "Hey, this is going to happen," and you're like, "Oh yeah, you're right. Let's make it let's make it happen." So in this case, like acoustics is, we always think of what we can hear. So, and honestly, all of sound technology, whether it's music or psychoacoustics or MP3s or the streaming of it, is all about like humans' perception of sound. And of course, that's especially focused on voice and music. Those are the two big things.
Right.
But of course, sound isn't about like the data or the bits. It's not about what you hear. Sound is, of course, just an actual physical thing. And so that's why sound can be used to detect bats, like way beyond the realm of human hearing. And it can also be used to detect elephants who are way below human hearing. And that's just where it's like the sound of our living planet is just this vastly underexplored domain, not just from a conservation perspective, but from a science perspective. That's like we're getting in with CWS, like a group of really high caliber scientists. Like is very exciting for us. But most importantly, because a nonprofit based around impact, it's the fact that you're connected to the communities. And the community, if you the communities aren't going anywhere. The people on the ground who have the farms in India and around the world, they deserve to belong. They deserve to stay there. And that sort of human-elephant conflict that sort of endangers both the wildlife that's there as well as the people who live there, that has to be reconciled. I don't think the technology is clearly the only or most comprehensive solution to that. It's really that community involvement that CWS represents. But if technology can help to speed up and make that more efficient, being able to detect elephants when they're in stealth mode, sneaking onto farms to take produce or to wreck it or do whatever elephants are doing in these areas, that's very dangerous to the people and dangerous to the elephants. And if they've sort of adapted to make it clear that people won't detect them, that's just based upon human senses. We can still detect them, and we're not detecting them to endanger the elephants. We're detecting them to send a message to CWS, so CWS can get on the phone with people and say, just stay calm. We have a solution for this. And so that's I think a good use of technology if we can solve these technological problems. How do you hear these very, very low frequencies? How do you put up technology in a place and have it survive? How do you connect all these pieces? So that's where I think we can lend a hand. And who doesn't want to work and protect elephants and protect people who are in conflict with them? Like this is just it's good for the soul. I feel like this is a really good project for us.
A
And
good for
we're
the
happy to be
soul
working with you.
project. No,
Yeah,
we're honored to be
yeah,
working with Rainforest Connection, and I like the way that you put it. A good for the soul project is always something worth pursuing. And yeah, you're right. I think this project kind of leads to a lot of what we discussed during this call, which was how do we put up something, test it out, iteration after iteration of changes, and in this case, leveraging a collaboration between organizations not even based on the same continent. Well, yours is based on every continent or multiple continents, but with CWS being in India and really trying to see technology with an on-ground implementation partner, the collaboration between that, and hopefully coming up with a solution that's viable, that works for everybody involved, and
mm.
at the end of the day is beneficial for people and wildlife. And promotes coexistence and fosters tolerance in these places that really need it.
And I'll say like this is our first real project in India. Of all the ones we've done around the world, we've always kind of resisted. We've always looked very interested. We've always been very interested in coming into India, but we keep finding things about the issues that we didn't feel like we could be as effective, like the fact that chainsaws aren't being used versus hand axes, or there's always some reason that we weren't going to be as effective as we thought we ought to be to work there. And this is the first time that I feel like we actually could make a difference. But it's only because of the partnership. So,
no,
but you guys know that. You know, CWS is awesome. That's why you're here.
No, oh, thank you. I think I can hear Kriti laughing somewhere. So I'm gonna I think call this a successful conversation. It's been like an hour of a really interesting chat. I know that there are a ton of questions that the audience has, and there are so many that we could go through. There's so many topics to discuss as well. But I do would really like to thank you for coming on and participating in this event. It was incredible to have you learn so much today about conservation tech, the work that you're doing. So, and thank you for all the work that you're doing, the work that your team is doing as well. It's incredible.
And thanks to everyone here who I'm sure is doing some pretty great work as well.
So we'll keep in touch. And for the audience, you know that our webinar series, which is Wildlife Chronicles, is going to continue. We will have podcasts and webinars coming up. You can catch up on previous episodes on our YouTube page, and we'll also have live streams that you can subscribe to cwsindia.org and just stay in touch. So thanks everyone. Thanks for being here and take care. Stay safe. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Thanks.